Hey there, welcome back or welcome if you're new. I'm Ramsey Dean, a licensed therapist, and on this channel, we explore how our past experiences shape our emotional health. Today, we are discussing fear of abandonment and borderline personality disorder, or BPD. We will explore what fear of abandonment looks like in daily life for those with BPD, where this symptom originates from, and how it interacts with and worsens other BPD symptoms. So what is borderline personality disorder? We are not going to get too much into the weeds here because if you clicked on this video, I'm going to assume you already know what BPD is. And if not, I have several other videos I will link down below that you can watch first and then come back to this one. But just to give a brief overview, BPD is a mental health condition known for intense emotions, unstable relationships, and a strong fear of abandonment. People with BPD tend to have mood swings, impulsive behaviors, and difficulty managing their emotions. And these issues tend to have really bad consequences for their relationships and their overall functioning in the world in general. So what is fear of abandonment? In borderline personality disorder, there are 9 symptoms outlined in the DSM, and number 1 is fear of abandonment. But what does fear of abandonment mean? Because this phrase is kind of vague. Fear of abandonment in BPD looks like a constant nagging worry that the people you care about the most are going to leave. Now, this fear is not just occasional or mild, it's usually intense and persistent, and it can overwhelm your thoughts and emotions. People with BPD have what I like to call an extremely sensitive abandonment radar. They can pick up on the smallest signs or cues that someone might be pulling away, and a lot of times these signs and cues are either imagined, so they're not even real, or they are exaggerated in their mind. For example, if a friend doesn't reply to a text message right away, or their partner seems a bit distant, these types of benign events can trigger a spiral of anxiety and fear for someone with BPD. This usually looks like excessive worry to the point where the person with BPD can't focus on anything else. This can look like catastrophizing, so jumping to the worst case scenarios, like thinking your partner's going to break up with you, for example. This can look like physical symptoms, so a racing heart, sweating, even panic attacks. This fear of abandonment can look like desperation for reassurance, so the person with BPD might start to send multiple follow-up messages or call repeatedly if their friend isn't answering the phone, or if they are afraid they're going to get broken up with, it might look like asking their partner over and over again, "Do you love me? Are we okay?" That type of stuff. Fear of abandonment in BPD can also manifest as self-blame and negative self-talk. So the person with BPD might think that they are annoying or worthless and not deserving of other people's love and connection. And over time, this can really take a toll on their self-esteem and become a vicious cycle. In some instances, the cycle of anxiety that comes with fear of abandonment in BPD can lead to impulsive behaviors as a way to manage their fear. So this could look like an angry outburst, substance use to numb the pain, or in some cases, even suicidal threats or gestures, and we are going to talk about some of this later in the video when we get into how fear of abandonment worsens other BPD symptoms. Now that we understand what fear of abandonment looks like in BPD, let's talk about where this symptom comes from. There's a couple of different theories in the research about where fear of abandonment and borderline originates from, but the most widely accepted is that it is born out of childhood trauma and neglect. Now, from my own personal anecdotal experience as a therapist who has worked with a lot of clients with BPD, I definitely believe this is true. When a child experiences trauma or neglect, their sense of safety and security is severely compromised. For instance, if you grew up in a home where physical abuse was common, you would have had to deal with the fears of being hurt by the very people who are supposed to protect and care for you. That environment would teach you that the world is unpredictable and dangerous, and more importantly, that the people you should trust are not sources of love and connection, but rather sources of pain and fear. Perhaps even more problematic than abuse is childhood emotional neglect, which I did a whole video on last week, and you should definitely check out if you haven't already. But people tend to think that emotional neglect isn't really as big of a deal as abuse, but it actually can lead to worse outcomes, especially when it comes to the ability to form and maintain healthy relationships as an adult. This is because we learn subconsciously how to engage in relationships from our parents or caregivers. It's this kind of parallel process where as our parents show us love and affection, hold us when we cry, soothe us when we are dysregulated, that type of thing, we are learning that, number 1, I can trust and rely on other human beings to be safe and emotionally supportive, and number 2, I don't need to be anxious about people being there for me. I can trust my loved ones will show up for me. But when we have parents who were dismissive of our emotional needs, or even worse, responded in a way that was scary, such as yelling at us, telling us to suck it up, that parallel process gets broken, and as an adult, we don't have any expectation that the people we love and care about are people that we can rely on emotionally. Now, when you combine this type of childhood trauma with a diagnosis like borderline personality disorder, it can manifest as this intense fear of abandonment. Other than childhood trauma, there's also some research to suggest that certain biological and genetic factors can contribute to the fear of abandonment seen in BPD. Specifically, there's been some research to suggest that your family history can play a role. So if you have a family history of BPD or other mood disorders like depression or anxiety, that puts you at higher risk. Your brain structure can also play a role. There have been some neuroimaging studies that have shown the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that processes emotions and threats, is often hyperactive in people with BPD, which would make you more prone to fear of abandonment. This kind of gets into the chicken or the egg argument though, in my opinion. Do these people actually have different brain structures, or did their brains change because of generational trauma and neglect? It's hard to know, and this is certainly not my area of expertise, but I figured I would include it because it is interesting and brain function is becoming a larger area of research when it comes to BPD, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Okay, let's dive into how fear of abandonment interacts with and worsens other BPD symptoms, and there are specifically 5 symptoms I want to touch on. Mood swings are what we might call emotion dysregulation or affective instability in the clinical world, impulsivity, self-harm, chronic feelings of emptiness, and unstable relationships. So that is what we are going to focus on in this next section of the video. One of the most problematic symptoms of BPD is emotion dysregulation, or in layman's terms, mood swings. And fear of abandonment really aggravates BPD mood swings. Remember, people with BPD have a heightened abandonment radar. And when that radar goes off, they might feel different emotions. Anger, sadness, panic, all of it in a short period of time. So we are talking about someone who is already prone to mood swings, and now we are turning up that heat. Fear of abandonment can also make it hard for people with BPD to return to baseline, so they get wound up emotionally faster and then struggle to come down once they are elevated. So this could look like earlier, we gave the example of a friend not responding to a text message right away. By the time the friend responds, even though you'd think the fear of abandonment should go away, by that point, the person with BPD may find it hard to calm down and return to baseline because they've already gotten too dysregulated. Fear of abandonment can also aggravate the impulsivity and self-harm that is common in people with borderline. People with BPD might use reckless spending of money, drugs or alcohol, binge eating, or lashing out in anger, for example, as a way to cope with their fear of abandonment. So instead of their fears coming out as mood swings, the person with BPD might use these other impulsive behaviors as a way to control their emotions. Some people with BPD might even turn to self-harm as a way to calm themselves down. They might even use self-harm as a maladaptive way to communicate their distress, seek attention, or control the situation. This can feel really manipulative to the other person involved, but it's important to remember that the person with BPD isn't doing this in a malicious way. The underlying motivation is that they feel out of control of their emotions and fearful of the relationship ending. And even though this might sound crazy to you, for people with BPD, this is very real. They're not making it up or being dramatic. This is a real physiological response happening in their body. Next, let's talk about chronic feelings of emptiness. People with BPD tend to have this persistent, sort of numb, empty feeling. A lot of times, people with BPD will talk about feeling like they have an inner void that they can't seem to fill, and they will try, unsuccessfully, to fill this void with other people. They'll attach their whole identity and sense of self-worth and meaning onto the people in their life. So when their fear of abandonment gets triggered and they perceive a threat to these relationships, that sense of emptiness that's kind of always there in the background can become very loud and overwhelming. This is part of why people with BPD can present as very helpless, hopeless, sad. It can almost look like depression. But it's really this pervasive and chronic feeling of emptiness inside of them that can really get intensified by fear of abandonment. Another core feature of BPD that gets aggravated by fear of abandonment is unstable relationships. People with BPD tend to have rapidly changing relationships, so people coming in and out of their life quickly, and their relationships tend to be filled with really dramatic and intense highs and lows. Fear of abandonment aggravates this relational instability in a few different ways. The clinginess and dependency that can come with fear of abandonment tend to push people away. People with BPD might demand constant reassurance and validation, which just becomes too much and too overwhelming for the people in their life, pushing them away and becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fear of abandonment also tends to fuel the cycle of BPD splitting. If you don't know what splitting is in borderline, I did a whole video about it you can check out to learn more. But basically, it's when the person with BPD bounces between being obsessed with the other person and thinking they are perfect, and then quickly changing and thinking their partner is useless, worthless, and untrustworthy. Fear of abandonment fuels this splitting cycle because it makes the person with BPD hypervigilant to any perceived rejection. And the minute they find something that they perceive as the other person pulling away, then that can cause them to split on the person. This splitting process can be very confusing and painful for the other person involved, and it pushes people away, resulting in this sort of revolving door of people in and out of their life. In addition to everything I just mentioned, the mood swings and impulsive behavior we talked about before also fuel this vicious cycle of unstable relationships for people with BPD. Because, just to be blunt, most people are not going to put up with mood swings, reckless behavior, and threatening self-harm all the time. It's just not a realistic expectation that people are going to stick around while you are behaving this way. This is the reason why one of the first things you learn in dialectical behavior therapy is mindfulness and distress tolerance. If I am working with a client who has BPD and their mood and behavior is highly volatile, the first thing I'm going to do is help them gain awareness of their triggers and their emotional hot buttons and what puts them at risk for impulsive behavior. DBT calls this mindfulness. And then I'm going to teach them skills that they can use to tolerate emotional distress and turn down the heat without engaging in behaviors that are going to keep ruining their relationships, getting them into trouble, and messing up their life, basically. DBT calls this distress tolerance. So we are learning how to recognize when we are getting amped up and how to interrupt that process and tolerate our feelings without being destructive. It takes a lot of work and a lot of practice, but everything I talked about in this video is treatable, and you can break these patterns if you are willing to learn new skills to replace your old behaviors. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video all the way until the end. It really means a lot to me. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments your experiences with fear of abandonment and if you have any questions. I'd love to continue this conversation because we really only scratched the surface, to be honest. On that note, take care and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.